Last week, we were looking at what probably would be regarded as the pivotal moment with respect to interest in the Pacific Northwest, and that was when, quite unexpectedly, 4 Nez Perce Indians showed up in St. Louis in the office of William Clark, asking for the white man's book of the Great Spirit, or words to that effect. I'm always a little reluctant to use that expression, but that was the expression they used, so I'm trying to be faithful to the historical moorings, but there is no sense in which the Bible is distinctively the white man's book, as you are very, very well aware. It is the book for all people, of all colors, of all ethnicities, of all races, and we are happy to declare that to be the case. But at that time, that was the way the book was widely referred to. Well, that did spark a huge response in the East, and there was just an explosion of interest in sending missionaries to the Northwest. As I mentioned last week, it was viewed as something of a Macedonian call. We're going to pick up that story really next week and start talking about how the first wave of missionaries began to arrive, but before that, we needed to run back in time a little bit more, and we looked at last week the legend, which has come down so well attested, though in various strands, traditions, forms, and versions, that all I can do is give you probably one of the better accepted versions of it. But the very fact that it came down in so many different strands suggests that there's something to it, and that was that so-called one prophecy, which originally was given to a native chief named Circling Raven, then to his son, whose name was Spokane Eliam, and then to his son, who we know of as Spokane Gary. And so I want to pick that story up, but not quite yet this week. We're still going to hold that out there as a little bit of a carrot, you know. But after that, we do have then a couple of interesting guys that come not as missionaries, but as mountain men. Men's men, you know, fur trappers, traders, and so on. The two that we've been interested in are both robust, powerful, committed, consistent Christian men. One we looked at last week, David Thompson. We're just going to finish up the tail end of his story this week. And the other that I'd like to deal with is Jedediah Smith. Some of you are familiar with his career as well. So we're going to be focusing most of our attention on Jedediah Smith this morning. Then, as I say, next week we'll start picking up the missionary interest in the Northwest that came after the visit of those 4 Nez Perce Indians. As I've been looking at the story of Jedediah Smith, one of the things that comes out consistently in his journals and his writings and his letters home, as we're going to see this morning, is how much he longed for a Christian community. I thought it was interesting because, of course, as you know, this fall we are giving special attention in the sermons and in the entire interest through the sermon series in Christian relationship, how we relate to each other. It's clear that as Christian people we are not called to isolation. We're not called to be islands, sort of living in a personal monastery all by ourselves, insulated from any other form of Christian relationship, but we are called to a community. We're called to relationships with one another. I hope many of you participated this last week, and guess who's coming to dinner? We did. It was wonderful, and that's the kind of thing we should be doing. Jedediah Smith didn't have much of that. He was in a bunch of mountain men, you know. They weren't known for their Christian virtue or fellowship, and he had to work it out more or less on his own. And you hear in his writings how much he longed for Christian relationship, and yet sometimes it's been said that the real test of the fervency of our faith is not how we do when we're with other Christians, but how we do when we're out there by ourselves. And in the case of Jedediah Smith, his testimony was almost a wonder to those who observed him, how consistently he maintained that integrity even in the harshest of circumstances. And it reminded me of the words of the Apostle Paul. I suppose Jedediah probably thought about this text more than once because I imagine he identified with it. But when Paul was in Rome in his second imprisonment, anticipating, probably knowing by this time, that his execution was going to be taking place in the not too far distant future, he wrote the last writing that we're aware of that came from his pen to his associate and understudy and disciple, really, Timothy. And this is in the 4th chapter of 2 Timothy, and he writes these words. Listen to Paul now describing his own kind of isolated experience. He says, "At my first defense, no one came to my support, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and save me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen." And that text, I bet, was an encouragement now and then to Jedediah, as he was similarly occasionally rescued from the lion's mouth, as we'll see. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Our Father, we're deeply grateful to you that you are the God of all mercy and grace, and while you have in your wonderful bounty called us into fellowship, into relationships that are mutually encouraging and supportive, that we are designed for friendship, for family. Nevertheless, in those occasions when we find ourselves out on our own, you are the one who sticks closer than a brother, and that you can give us help and courage even in those moments, as you did in the case of this remarkable man, Jedediah Smith. We pray that our review of his story this morning would be encouraging to each one of us. We ask these things in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, well, as I say, I want to finish up just briefly David Thompson. If you were here last week, then there we are. Hopefully this will ring a bell. We looked at all of this information that I have here. We didn't really look at his family. David Thompson was married to a woman whose name was Charlotte Small. She was the daughter of a Scottish fur trader and a Cree Indian. And so she was one of those people that had one foot in each camp. They had a wonderful relationship. David Thompson writes frequently of her in his journals, especially in those times when they're separated, which was frequent. They had 13 children, notwithstanding the separation, however that happens. They had 7 sons and 6 daughters. 2 of them died in childhood. That was not uncommon. In fact, that's really pretty good statistics for the day. So most of their children survived. He wrote of his wife, who he loved dearly and obviously had the deepest appreciation for, quote, "My lovely wife is the blood of these people, speaking their language and well educated in the English language, which gives me great advantage." He liked the fact that when she was with him, she was both, of course, conversant with English culture and society, but she was also equally conversant with the native culture and language and society, and that gave him great benefit along the way. Thompson himself was interestingly even-handed as he assessed Native American culture. He was certainly a deeply committed Christian, but he was never judgmental as he observed the religious practices of those that he encountered in his various exploratory missions. This is typical of the kind of description you'd find in his journals. He said, quote, "They seemed to acknowledge a great spirit who dwelled in the clouds to be the master of everything. And when they died, their souls went to him. The sun, moon, and stars were all gods, but the sun above all, and that he made the lightning, thunder, and rain." Thompson at the same time had this sense that this population of native folks that he encountered would be a ripe field for missionary effort. And so on another occasion he wrote, "The tribes offer a most extensive and hopeful field for the labors of missionaries, to bring them the knowledge of the heavenly Redeemer of mankind." Thompson was always cordial, and yet at the same time believed that the greatest advantage that could be given to these would be some information and presentation of the gospel, which indeed did happen some years after his contact with them. The later years of David Thompson were not altogether happy. He wound up back in Montreal, which was his hometown, and spent the rest of his career there. His greatest achievement, most folks would say, was producing the 1814 map of that vast region that we broadly call the Pacific Northwest, including a fair amount of Canada. This is a picture. I doubt that you can tell much by looking at it, but I'm just going to tell you it's a work of genius. The detail that is inscribed upon it, the locations of rivers, mountains, landmarks of various descriptions, was so precise that this map was considered authoritative well into the 20th century. It was really almost a marvel of its time that this man, working with just his simple surveying equipment, could produce such a vast and accurate production of such a vast area of land. That's the good news. The bad news is an English map maker stole it, reproduced it, made a lot of money on it, never gave Thompson the least credit for it, nor did he, of course, get any revenue from it. And David Thompson simply kind of dismissed that as one of those vicissitudes of life, that he, in his great labors, had produced this thing, and yet really, at least in his lifetime, was not really acknowledged adequately for it. Some years later, it was David Thompson who was hired jointly by the United States and Canada when finally a boundary line was drawn defining the separation of those two countries, and Thompson was the one that led the survey team. So every time you cross the border from the United States into Canada or come back, you can tip your hat to David Thompson. He's been there and actually helped to draw that map. When Thompson was about 50 years old, he met a geologist named John Bigsby, who gives an interesting description of Thompson. Now, this is in his later years. He said, this is Bigsby writing, I was well placed at a table between one of the Ms. McGillivrys and a singular-looking person of about 50. He was plainly dressed, quiet and observant. His figure was short and compact. His black hair was worn long all around and cut square, as if by one stroke of the shears, just above the eyebrows. His complexion was of the gardener's ruddy brown, while the expression of his deeply furrowed features was friendly and intelligent, but his cut short nose gave him an odd look. His speech betrayed the Welshman, although he left his native hills when very young. I might have been spared this description of Mr. David Thompson by saying he greatly resembled Curran, the Irish orator. Later, Bigsby became an associate of Thompson's, and so he writes kind of retrospectively, I afterwards traveled much with him, and have now only to speak of him with great respect, or I ought to say with admiration. No living person possesses a tithe of his information respecting the Hudson's Bay countries. Never mind his Bunyan-like face and cropped hair, he has a very powerful mind and a singular faculty with picture making. Thompson was quite the storyteller, and one of those people that could get you right into the experience. So anyway, Bigsby continues his description. He can create a wilderness and people it with warring savages, or climb the Rocky Mountains with you in a snowstorm so clearly and palpably that only shut your eyes and you'll hear the crack of a rifle, or feel the snowflakes melt on your cheeks as he talks. So Thompson was one of these remarkable personalities, and he carried that kind of genius for drama and for description all the way through his life, even though sometimes he went in his later years through some difficult times. While living in Montreal there, he was approached by a group that wanted to start a church. Thompson, being a Christian man, wanted to help out. He had a fair amount of money that he had made from his labors in trapping and surveying, and he put most of it up to help build this church, which ultimately failed. And so he lost a huge amount of his resources and really was relatively impoverished in the last years of his life. He wound up living with his wife, Charlotte. The two of them lived with one of their daughters there during the last few years of their life, more or less dependent upon them. David Thompson died on February 10th, 1857 in near obscurity. It wasn't until some years later that he was really rediscovered. In 1926, a monument was placed at his unmarked grave there in Canada. Later, he was honored by the Canadian government on the 100th anniversary of his death with a postage stamp that bears an image of him. There's a monument maintained by the state of North Dakota that celebrates him. And of course, many places are named for him: Thompson Falls, Thompson River, and so on. So even though he himself died in rather unknown circumstances for all that he had accomplished, we're happy to report that history has recovered some decent recollection of him. All right, that's the end of last week's discussion. So now we're moving on, and I'm going to hope to try to get through this, which will be a challenge in itself. Jedediah Strong Smith. I don't know how much names affect you, but I think in his case it might have had some effect. Many of you are familiar with this man, so I'll just give you a quick sketch of why he's remembered. He was a hunter, a trapper, a fur trader, a trailblazer, an author, a cartographer. He was the first of many accomplishments now on the United States side of things. You see, he's kind of the answer to David Thompson. Not that they were in competition, but he lives at the same time. You can see he was born in 1799, the year that Thompson married. He died in 1831. So Jedediah Smith, only about 30 years old at the time of his death, is sort of planted right in the middle of the longer career of Thompson, but does in many ways the same thing in a more southerly venue, more in what we would call America or the United States then. Thompson was more Canadian. Smith was the first to cross overland from Salt Lake to California. He was the first American to cross the Sierra Nevada and the Great Basin, that kind of great vast wilderness area there. He was the first to reach Oregon country from California. He discovered the South Pass to Oregon Territory, which became very significantly part of what was called the Oregon Trail years later. But above all of that, he was a man of passionate, devoted, consistent, and conspicuous Christian faith. And I think anyone that knew him was immediately impressed with the fact that that was something that was not the least bit secret about him. A book written by Robert Cleland entitled "This Reckless Breed of Men," a book about mountain men in general, said of Jedediah Smith, "Perhaps the greatest of all American mountain men was devout a Christian as a Scotch Covenanter." We talked about the Scotch Covenanters earlier, and they were conspicuous for their passionate Christian devotion, and Smith was certainly cut out of the same kind of cloth. Smith's own journal is peppered with references to his Christian understanding and Christian commitment. This is simply typical. How often, he writes, ought we on our bended knees to offer up our thanks for the gift of his dear son. Smith's story begins in Bainbridge, New York. He descended from Huguenots. We've talked about them earlier, those French Calvinists who were persecuted and really spread throughout parts of Europe and eventually came to the United States. He, however, encountered his first experience of real Christian understanding from the Second Great Awakening, which took place in the New England states and was more or less pushed by Methodist preachers who at that time were ferocious and emotional and effervescent, and so that was kind of the spiritual heritage really that he had from his own childhood as he was growing up. Along with his interest in the Christian faith, he had a very deep interest in nature and in adventure, which is probably true of many young boys and so on, but this was fueled by a book that he received from a guy named Dr. Titus Simmons, which happened to be the journals of Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark, of course, did their famous excursion 1804 to 1806, when about 10 years later, Jedediah Smith was in his teenage years. He received a copy of this. It was at least taken for granted that Smith carried with him two books throughout his career. One was the Bible, and the other was the journals of Lewis and Clark. That was what he did as his daily devotions, read those two books, you know. The Smith family was never wealthy, at least at the beginning. They left New York, moved to Ohio, really looking for work. From there, Jedediah himself moved on to Illinois, and he was scouring the newspaper one morning looking for an ad for help wanted, dishwasher, something like that, you know. And he saw an ad placed by a guy named General William H. Ashley. Ashley was advertising for adventurous young men. This is what it said. 2, enterprising young men. The subscriber wishes to engage 100 men to ascend the river Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. For particulars, inquire of Major Andrew Henry, near the Lead Mines in the county of Washington, who will ascend with and command the party, or to the subscriber at St. Louis, William H. Ashley. Well, Jedediah headed right over to his office, stood in his doorway. Ashley looked up and saw this impressive 6-foot-tall, blue-eyed, 23-year-old Jedediah Smith, hired him on the spot. He had an intuition about the man that turned out to be quite accurate. Ashley sent Jedediah off to a kind of boot camp experience at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains near what was called Fort Aricarus. And there, Jedediah learned some basic survival skills. He was trained in various sort of frontier skills such as trapping beaver and hunting buffalo and other kinds of practical skills that a person needs to make it in the wild. And then he was called back to the region of the Great River where Ashley himself was organizing his first team to conduct this expedition. As he returned, the group that was there were attacked by some Aricarus Indians. Don't know exactly what precipitated this attack, but it took place in 1822. Jedediah Smith, of course, had no military training whatsoever. He was simply a young man, and he conducted himself with a remarkable bravery in the face of this attack that wound up killing 13 of Ashley's men. But as they were fighting and scraping and trying to get out from under this surprise attack, it came to everybody's notice that Jedediah was fighting with a great deal of bravery and throwing himself into harm's way, more or less selflessly giving himself to the task of protecting others. And those who survived, and especially Ashley, noted his conduct. And Ashley not only had him at that point hired, but actually made him kind of a foreman right at that point because of the depth of character that he really saw in him. And he was well received even by men who had greater experience and were older as their natural leader. So he had that kind of personal gravitas that caused people to follow him and trust him. He was immediately given the nickname, the moniker that followed him for the rest of his career, the Praying Trapper. And that nickname was given to him because that was evidently the kind of person he was. He himself, however, felt the loneliness of his circumstances. He wrote a letter to his parents in which he said in part, quote, "I feel the need of the watch and care of a Christian church. Our society is of the roughest kind of men. Men of good morals seldom enter into the business of this kind. I hope you will remember me before the throne of grace." That's the kind of thing he sent to his parents, and it's what makes me think about Paul. Jedediah was separated from Christian fellowship most of his career, and yet at the same time he maintained this very evident devotion to Christ, devotion to a life that was conspicuously reflective of a Christian ethic. And people, though they may not have shared always in that ethic, nevertheless admired him. And he certainly was one they trusted, though he went through a bit of ridicule along the way just because he was such a man. His first great expedition was an attempt to find what was called the South Pass. The North Pass had been mapped out by Lewis and Clark, and of course up in Canada there was another pass, but this was one that would be more or less south of Yellowstone, so he heads off in 1823 on that job. From there he was looking for, of course, a crossing over the Rocky Mountains, and it was on this occasion that one of the most memorable experiences of his life took place, in which he was attacked by a grizzly bear. I happened to be there at the time and caught this photo. It was scary, you know. Anyway, this is probably about what it looked like. Jedediah had no time to respond. This bear came out of the bushes and knocked him to the ground, broke a couple of ribs, clawed across his face, and actually ripped off some of the skin from his face and his ear. Were all sort of dangling there. So it was a vicious attack. And then for some reason, the bear went running off into the wild, and there was Jedediah laying on the ground. Here was the leader of these men, who was there on the ground, more or less at the point of death, and they didn't know what to do because he was their leader. And so in one of the most remarkable moments of his career, which is described by these guys, he began in a kind of cool and calm fashion to tell them how to administer medical care to him. And he told them to go get some water, wash the wounds. At one point, the problem was that his ear was just dangling there by a little thread of skin, and they didn't know what to do. And Jedediah said, sew it back on. And they didn't know, you know, he said, get needle and thread and sew the ear back on. So he always had a very strange looking ear for the rest of his career, and actually he lost an eyebrow in it. It did leave some permanent disfigurement, which is why whenever you see pictures of Jedediah Smith, he always has long hair. He was not a hippie. This was just kind of his way of camouflaging some of the damage that was done to him by that grizzly bear when he was just in his 20s. Once he had recovered from that attack, they were able to find themselves among some friendly Crow Indians, and they were asking about the prospect of locating some pass across the Rockies, and the Crow Indians actually were able to give some guidance in that regard. So they crossed through this pass and found themselves on the other side then in the region of Utah. And this leads to what was called the first California trip. Actually sold out, and the company that he owned was purchased at this point by Smith, by a guy named David Jackson, another guy named William Sublette. So the three of them actually became now co-owners of the company that had once hired Smith, and this was in 26. And then Smith, the three of them split up, so each went on their own kind of separate trapping and exploratory excursions. Smith was looking for the legendary Buenaventura River. You know, it doesn't exist, but many people had heard of some kind of legend of a river that flowed from that region down into the Pacific. So Smith was trying to confirm or deny the existence of that river. And in the process of doing so, arrived amongst the Mojave Indians at a time when they were pretty much spent. They had used up a lot of their resources, water was scarce, food was scarce, and Jedediah writes in his journal, "We had lost so many horses that we were now all on foot. My men and the remainder of my horses were worn out with fatigue, and hardships had emaciated with hunger." And again, these friendly Mojave Indians helped them along the way. They provided, through various trades and so on, the resources that they needed to continue. And so on that basis, Jedediah was able to cross the Mojave Desert and reach California. This map, hopefully you can see that the region that I've circled in black there is kind of the general venue where Jedediah was working. So this is what we would call Utah, Southern California, was more or less where he was. This is a painting by Frederick Remington, 1906, depicting, as he pictured it, this trek across the Mojave Desert. I don't know how much it resembles reality, but I kind of like it, so there it is. He wound up at San Gabriel Mission in California in the fall of 1826. Beautiful place, it's there to this day. The thing you have to keep in mind is that California at this point belonged to the Mexicans, you see, and so he had actually crossed over into foreign country. The Mexican-American War had not taken place yet, and yet they were more or less, having just crossed the Mojave, they were needing some kind of place to land, and this was an inviting place so to do. So they were warmly received by the president of the mission, Jose Bernardo Sanchez, not so warmly received by the Mexican governor, whose name was Enchudilla, who believed that Smith and his men were probably spies, because there was rising tension by this time between Mexico and the United States over this real estate that at this point was controlled by Mexico. And so he was very suspicious of any Americans that just came wandering in, you know, and Jedediah Smith looked like someone who might be there for other reasons, even though Smith protested his innocence continually showed the journals, showed all of his personal effects, none of which betrayed any evidence that he was on some kind of surreptitious mission, But nevertheless, Jedediah was not quite so sure, and Smith was actually arrested and held incarcerated for a period of time. Finally, under pressure, he was moved, that is, Jedediah was moved to release Smith. He ordered him to go back the same way he came and never return, both of which orders Jedediah Smith disregarded. But he did recross, he did head out of town by the same road. Then he turned north, went up through the San Joaquin Valley, and at this point he had a problem. The men that were with him, they had about 1,500 pounds of beaver pelts that they were hoping to get to the Mountain Man Rendezvous, which was quite a ways away. The rendezvous was where all the mountain men would get together, swap stories, swap stuff, and it was kind of that point of regrouping, and Smith needed to get there. It was going to be taking place in 2 or 3 months out. He was looking for that legendary Buenaventura River, couldn't find it, and finally decided it just ain't there, And so this was, again, one of those really remarkable moments. He took 2 of his best men, and the 3 of them took those pelts. He left the rest of his guys behind and set out on what was considered the epic journey across the Sierra Nevadas to get to that rendezvous. This was at a time when there was still a lot of snow. It was hardship on steroids. It was a very long, arduous, difficult trip in which their very survival was very much in question throughout. They dumped out the other side of the Sierra Nevadas into what's called the Great Basin, a kind of broad desert area. So the whole trip was really a rather remarkable feat. He writes in his journal during this trip, when they were kind of at the ragged edge, these words. He, quote, "In those moments," describing the hardships they were experiencing, "in those moments, how trifle all those things that hold such an absolute sway over the busy and prosperous world. My dreams are not of gold or ambitious honors, but of my distant, quiet home." Not altogether clear whether he means a home back east or maybe a home that's heavenly in character, maybe a little of both. But you can see that even in this hardship, Jedediah's heart and faith are still very much intact in the face of this challenge. On July 3rd, these 3 men reached this Mountain Man Rendezvous, which was in the region of the Great Salt Lake. They had been given up for dead by most folks, and when they entered the camp, there was an eruption, a roar of cheering for these guys because it was known what they had just accomplished. The first wheeled, or the earliest wheeled vehicle that far west was a cannon, and they set it off to celebrate the arrival of Jedediah Smith and these other men at that rendezvous. So it was again one of those sort of superhuman accomplishments. Smith did return then back to the other side of the mountains. He, in the process of so doing, was attacked by some not so friendly Mojave Indians in 1827. I was mentioning David Thompson. He never really was, to my knowledge, attacked. He never found himself in a kind of war situation. Jedediah Smith several times was in those circumstances, and some people have thought, well, maybe he was picking the fight. It seems to me, when you're familiar with his story, that he was always laboring to find a peaceful relationship with the native population, was quite appreciative of them. But for whatever reasons, he found himself in the thick of things more than once, and this was one of those occasions. So this was a surprise attack, and actually wound up killing 10 of the men that were traveling with Smith at that point. There were 2 that were captured, and they had to make a desperate stand, and it was kind of touch and go, but they finally were able to escape from this situation. So once again, lacking any better option, they wound up at the San Gabriel Mission, hoping for some quarters there, for some help and support there, but of course in express violation of the command that Jedediah had given them earlier. So Jedediah once again arrests them, this time convinced that these guys must be spies, and once again Jedediah was held incarcerated for a time, but eventually was once again released. He must have been a good talker because he was able to get out of there again. From there, he headed up the Pacific coast, what we would call Highway 1, you know, and 101 right along the coast. He went right up that region. So every time you drive that road, you should give thanks for Jedediah Smith. There's actually a national park in there named for him. He was the first to reach Oregon country by land along the coast, but once again, he was attacked on his way by some Umpqua Indians. There were 19 men with Smith, 15 were killed. So again, this was a devastating attack. They had a fair amount of product of trapping, pelts and horses and so on. All of it was taken. The 4 men, basically on foot, had to struggle north until they finally got to Fort Vancouver, which is where the Hudson Bay Company was meeting, or had their headquarters. As it turned out, he met on this occasion Eliam Spokane. Eliam Spokane, the father of Spokane Gary, happened to be there. The time frame for this was after Eliam Spokane had, with great and deep emotion, relinquished his son into the care of the Hudson Bay Company to take him to the Red River Mission. So the son is gone, and Eliam Spokane has done this based largely on that prophecy that had come down, that this book of the Great Spirit was going to be brought along, and he always watched for clues and traces of this. He had seen it with David Thompson, who he met. David Thompson carried such a book. And now, again, he meets Jedediah Smith, and the evidence is that the two of them, speaking kind of using sign language and so on, were able to establish a rapport and a friendship in which, once again, Eliam Spokane was able to confirm something of the truth of that prophecy as he met a man who was evidently a Christian and had one of those strange things with leaves that we call books, of course, and it seemed to be the books of the words of the Great Spirit. So this is a remarkable moment that took place, only briefly documented, but it does seem that it actually happened right about then. The president of the Hudson Bay Company was a man named George Simpson, and he sent, along with Jedediah Smith, a man named McLeod, to go down and try to recover the lost property from these Umpqua Indians who had been responsible for the attack. They did find them, they did recover that property and so on, and they came back to Hudson's Bay outpost there at Fort Vancouver with 700 beaver skins, 39 horses, not all in great shape. John McLaughlin, who actually was running the Fort Vancouver outpost there, paid Smith $2,600, pretty fair amount of money in those days for the goods, but also insisted that he go away. Remember, this is Hudson's Bay Company. Jedediah Smith owns his own fur trading company, so this is competition, you know. And McLaughlin realized that he appreciated what had happened to Smith, but he didn't want him in too close a proximity. Smith himself was a pretty acute observer of what was going on, and he writes later something of his assessment of it. He, at the same time, wrote in a letter to his brother, quote, "I find myself one of the most ungrateful creatures imaginable. Oh, when shall I be under the care of a Christian church? I need your prayers," he says. "Oh, the perverseness of my wicked heart." Isn't this amazing? This Jedediah Smith, so heroic, and yet as is true of Christian people, as they increase in sanctification, they don't become more aware of their virtue, they become more aware of their vice, you know, and that happened with Smith. "I entangle myself altogether too much in the things of time. I must depend entirely on the mercy of God, who is abundant in goodness and will not cast off any who will sincerely call upon him. Again I say, pray for me." So he's writing to his brother in this moment in his career. Well, after this, he sold his fur trading business. He had a further excursion into Blackfoot territory. It was quite profitable, and so he was able to basically liquidate his position. The three of them sold to a company that came to be called the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. And so at this point, Jedediah Smith is at least briefly out of the business. He returns at that point to St. Louis, and while there, he wrote a letter in which he gives his observation of what was going on in the Hudson's Bay area there, especially at Fort Vancouver, because he felt that what was happening had some political overtone that he thought should be communicated, and so he wrote a letter to the Secretary of War, whose name was John Eaton, warning of British attempts to alienate the native population against Americans and create a kind of hostile attitude toward them. He felt that some of his own grief at the hands of some of these natives were actually being fostered a bit by the propaganda campaign being carried on at that point by the British. So for whatever it was worth, it certainly had some influence in policy making on those who received it. In a book entitled Men Against the Mountains, Alson Jess Smith wrote this concerning that moment in Smith's life. He says, "The observant Jedediah had watched the spectacle of the winter trade with the Flatheads, Pend Oreilles, Kootenays, Nez Perce, and Spokanes, written in his journal, worked on his maps, and, if one highly esteemed source is correct, engaged in some missionary work that was to have considerable significance for the Hudson's Bay." So Jedediah, while he was there, he's observing what's happening in the trading. He's also engaged in a little bit of unofficial missionary labors as well with the native population that he encountered, and all of this is documented by this author. Once Smith had sold his position or his company, he was able to send help to his family, provide for them rather substantially. He also purchased property in St. Louis, and then he went to work, as David Thompson had done, on a map. He wasn't at the same skill level as David Thompson, who was trained in surveying, but for a guy that was basically a layman to this career, he did a pretty decent job, and he began mapping out kind of the broad results of his travels through the West, and especially through that part of what became the United States. But in doing so, he began to realize that there were certain holes and gaps in his notations that needed additional information and exploration. So he went on an expedition actually working for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, the company that had bought him out, with a company of 74 men to do a little further exploration, a little bit further trapping. They led a supply wagon train for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company in 1831, ran short on water, and so Smith went off by himself in order to find water along the Cimarron River Valley in Kansas. He never returned. They waited as long as they felt they could, and then finally the rest of the camp had to pack up, and they wound up in Santa Fe, and they found a Mexican merchant there who was selling some of the personal effects of Jedediah Smith. They made inquiries and learned that the merchant had acquired these from a band of Comanche hunters. Some further investigation was able to locate these individuals, and the story that eventually came out of it was that Jedediah had found at least what appeared to be a possible source of water, but in the process of doing so was encountered by about 20 Comanche Indians. He had made signs of peace to them, indicating his intentions were not the least bit threatening. He was simply trying to find water, but they more or less circled him, and one of them shot him in the back shoulder. And Jedediah, kind of as a reflex, turned around and discharged his firearm, killing the guy that had shot him, at which time Jedediah himself was shot and killed, and that was the end of our friend Jedediah. So he died in a rather bloody way, but it was a punctuation to rather a remarkable career. The son of, or the brother of Jedediah Smith wrote these words to his father to inform him of the death of his son Jedediah. He said, quote, "My dear father, do not take it to heart too sorely. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be his name. May we not hope that Jedediah's faith was true and will be rewarded." Jedediah Smith was a typical mountain man. This was a certain genre of American maleness back in those days, as you're probably aware. He was known as a pious and reserved man. He was known to often read the Bible when it was not very common to see people doing that, meditate daily, pray daily, often in a conspicuous way on his knees, kind of like George Washington and those famous pictures of him. Even when other people are watching, he didn't seem to be disturbed by it, and so that was part of the way that he carried on his Christian commitment. Smith was known as a modest man in a culture that was given to boasting and bragging of the most outrageous proportions. Smith was always very modest and reserved in anything that he said about himself. He had an extraordinarily dry sense of humor, which most people simply interpreted as being very stern and humorless. But beneath the surface, he had that kind of twinkle in his perspective on life. He avoided immorality of every kind. This also was one of the unhappy aspects of the mountain man culture. They didn't have a very good sexual ethic, and especially with the native population of women, there was an awful lot of going on that simply would be unfortunate and really tragic in many ways. But Smith lived well above that, was never known as having any participation in that kind of thing whatsoever. He was known as a man who never smoked, never got drunk, or ever used profanity. He was known for his meticulous attempts to record his observations. He was a scientist. He had that kind of scientific outlook. And so when he wasn't engaged in more active and strenuous activities, he was always kind of making notes about his observations of nature, of topography, and so on. He always, at least as near as we can tell, tried to maintain friendly, cordial relationships with the native population. For the most part, was successful, with the exception of those that I've just mentioned to you. He was called the landmark of mapping the American West, kind of the American side of what David Thompson had done further to the north. He discovered important links in what became known as the Oregon Trail, and so that later story we'll be telling separately. He was commemorated, of course, many of you know this, in the Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park, Jedediah Smith Memorial Trail, the Smith River, the Jedediah Smith Wilderness, and the Teton Range. One historian says of him, quote, the first American to travel overland to California, cross the Mojave Desert, cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, and travel overland from California to Oregon. His journals greatly expanded the knowledge of the American West and proved invaluable to trappers and wagon trains who came after him. Today, he is recognized as the greatest American Western land explorer after Lewis and Clark. 1 year after his death, in a newspaper article about him, this was included in that article, quote, when his party was in danger, Mr. Smith was always among the foremost to meet it and the last to flee. Without being connected with any church, he was a Christian. The lone wilderness had been his place of meditation, and the mountaintop his altar. And though he fell under the spears of the savages, and none can tell where his bones are bleaching, he must not be forgotten. He was forgotten. So for about 75 years after his death, you heard virtually nothing about Jedediah Smith, this man who had been such a remarkable, powerful presence and influence in shaping this very early stage of the expansion to the West, and was such a conspicuous Christian, was nevertheless more or less passed over until some years later. His reputation was revived and continues to be revived to this day, but originally by H.C. Dale's book, The Ashley Smith Explorations and the Discovery of the Central Route to the Pacific. That's a 1918 book. Sullivan's Travels of Jedediah Smith, 1934, the Dictionary of Biography, 35, Dale Morgan's Jedediah Smith and the Opening of the West, 53, and then finally the publication of Smith's own journals that took place in 1977. So we're happy to report that though Jedediah Smith was passed over for a while, history has finally recovered him. So the reason I've treated him is because, number one, he is a man we as Christians should be proud of in the best sense of the word. There have been heroic Christian people who have done many remarkable things that have contributed immensely to benefits that the rest of us enjoy. And it seems to me it's interesting that when we think about the Pacific Northwest, we have David Thompson working kind of up in the Canadian side and Jedediah Smith working more on the American side, contemporaries that God in His providence ordained should be men who in many ways kind of opened the doors for others who would come later. Later missionaries relied on the labors of Jedediah Smith. Last week we looked at David Livingstone, who did something like that in Africa, as you recall. These guys who go out there and kind of get the lay of the land so that others who will come later can build on the accomplishments that they were able to achieve. But for me, the thing that is most impressive about Jedediah Smith is that, as I mentioned to you earlier, when he was alone, when he was cut off from Christian fellowship, when he was having to work this whole thing out in a kind of isolated context, there is no evidence whatsoever that there was a lapse. He's one of those guys, there was never a screw up along the way. I wish I could say that about me. But here's a man who just somehow, in the face of unbelievable obstacles and pressure, kept his Christian faith intact. My friends, I believe the reason he did that was because God's grace was richly at work in his life, because that's the only thing that keeps any of us constant in our faith. And as the Apostle Paul reminded Timothy in the text we read earlier, the grace of God was with Paul, and the grace of God was with Jedediah, and we can be so grateful that God works in people's lives in that way. So when we look at Jedediah, I hope we don't think, wow, I'm just not cut out of the same stuff that that guy. I could never do anything like that. Because you see, the same grace that was working in his life, my friends, is at work in yours. And that can give us great courage and hope.